everybody. Pleased to have you here. I want to first start by acknowledging that this lecture today by Rob Nixon is sponsored by the Environmental Ethics Initiative, and tell you a little bit about our initiative. We are a group of faculty who are devoted to interdisciplinary research and teaching on the environment. And the initiative is funded by the Nature Conservancy to sponsor a lecture series and eventually a conference on environmental ethics. We're intent on trying to invigorate research and teaching at BYU by increasing awareness of and responsibility for contemporary environmental problems, and for exploring and articulating the grounds for environmental ethics and solutions, and promoting and exploring the academic and ethical bases for effective conservation and stewardship. And we've had already this semester Barry Lopez, W.S. Merwin, and Sanjan, the chief conservation biologist for the Nature Conservancy. Next semester we'll have some more speakers, so keep your eyes out for those. Naomi Oreskes is going to come, and Peter Kariva, and conservation biologist, will be coming, and some others. So we're grateful to the Kennedy Center for their support and help in publicity and recording these lectures. Let me tell you a little bit about Rob Nixon. I have had the pleasure of working with him professionally over the last couple of years on a joint project, but it was really my reading of his new book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, that I realized that he would be very vital to come here to BYU, given our interest here at this university in international issues, international development, and concern for the poor. Because this book, I think, is a real landmark in research. Rob Nixon is the Rachel Carson Professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he specializes in creative nonfiction, world literature in English, environmentalism in literature, African and Caribbean literature, and contemporary British literature. He's a frequent contributor to the New York Times, and his writing has also appeared in The New Yorker, Atlantic Monthly, Village Voice, and London Review of Books. He's published this book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, about which he will talk today, and also Dreambirds, The Natural History of a Fantasy, which was selected as a notable book of the year by the New York Times Book Review and as one of the 10 best books of the year by Esquire. And he's also the recipient of numerous awards and a very well-respected and regarded scholar in the field of eco-criticism. I thought I would just read one paragraph. I had the honor to review his book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, for a journal recently, and I just wanted to read one paragraph from that review so you have some sense, at least, of my own perception of the value of this book and the value of this lecture today. Rob Nixon takes literary criticism to task, deservedly so, for being parochial in its own right, failing to avail itself of broader social, geopolitical, and environmental contexts in the scientific and social scientific research that pertains to them. This is no idle criticism. Nixon's book is the best monograph in eco-criticism to date of such interdisciplinarity and planetary reach, mapping out this needed international and environmental turn for future generations. Indeed, it might not be hyperbolic to say that given its deeply comparative, rigorously interdisciplinary, and consistently brilliant and thorough analyses of the environmental and political crossroads out of which contemporary post-colonial writers have emerged, Nixon's book belongs among the most important and compelling works of literary criticism of recent years. What emerges from this well-researched book is the implication that no serious consideration of the fate of literature in the 21st century can afford to ignore the fundamental problems of disparity of wealth and disparity of environmental health that shape and often motivate virtually every inter- and intranational conflict in the world today. It doesn't hurt that Nixon writes with sweeping and persuasive prose that is accessible for a wide range of readers, while also engaging various international contexts and cultures, various genres of literature, and always grounded in the relevant science and social science. It is a triumph of scholarship, ethical to its root and directed everywhere. So it's my honor to welcome Rob Nixon. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, George, for that typically generous introduction. I'm delighted to be here and honored to be part of this series. I don't need to tell you that George is a great force for good in his own abilities as a writer, the reach of his writing across disciplines, across modes, and also as a bridge builder between institutions and between fields. The kind of bridge building that is so necessary in these times. I wanted to situate what I'm going to say today a little bit in the context of this remarkable year that planet Earth has been going through, this convulsive year of protests and uprisings across the globe, starting perhaps as the vegetable vendor who immolated himself in Tunisia, spreading to Tahrir Square, across the Middle East, Wisconsin, the Occupy movement, Madrid, Greece. It seems to me that there are certain threads that run through these social movements that have been arising. They're clearly arising out of different contexts, but there are some common grounds. And one of them concerns a word that George just used, which is the word disparity. And it seems to me that the sort of ethics of disparity have reached a kind of tipping point in this year. And what we have seen over and over again is ordinary citizens rising up and saying that it's unacceptable to have an ever-deepening, ever-widening chasm between the uber-rich and the ultra-poor, between the haves and the never-will-haves. That this is socially short-sighted, and that a greater swath of society deserves to have a chance at a dignified future. And that pursuit of a dignified future for a broad spectrum of civic society, that pursuit has been registered in a number of different rhetorics that you see echoing across the world. And one of those is the rhetoric of justice, another is fairness, another is dignity, another is decency. And it was very noticeable in the broad coalition that emerged in Wisconsin, where I teach. In this broad coalition in the spring, this word decency really resonated with sort of Midwestern values. It was a word that people took up from a variety of backgrounds, and insisting that there was an indecent distribution of access to a dignified future. Now, clearly, these uprisings, these social movements have had a very broad base, but they have been disproportionately driven by the young. And one of the things I'll be talking about today is environmental time, how we perceive environmental time, and how those perceptions impact society. And it seems to me that these very often youth-driven movements are registering an awareness of the inequitable outsourcing of damage to younger people and to generations yet unborn, in other words. And a sense that the political establishments in these many, many countries have failed to take seriously or failed to address the emergencies of the long term. And those emergencies are educational, they have to do with job prospects, and they have to do very much with the environment. So there's a sense, I think, among many ordinary citizens across the world that the sort of two-year electoral cycle is insufficient to deal with the kind of advanced planning, the kind of foresight that is necessary to tackle these long-term emergencies. And so these questions are strategic, and they also have to do with a sense of an imaginative poverty that many people, I think, feel in relation to dealing with time, inhabiting time, and inhabiting the future with a greater sense of distributive equity and with a greater sense of answerability to the future, of stewarding our resources differently. So I want to move on to, against that backdrop, to talk a little bit about this book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor. We're used to thinking of violence in terms that are immediate, explosive, and spectacular. In other words, violence as erupting into instant and concentrated visibility. But I believe we need to think through the strategic and representational challenges posed by what I call slow violence. In other words, a violence that is neither instantaneous nor spectacular, but instead is incremental. It builds attritionally. And its calamitous repercussions are postponed over time, over a variety of time frames. So this question of postponement is very critical here. So to think about violence in this way is to complicate conventional assumptions of violence as a bounded act, okay? Bounded in time and highly visible and targeted typically at a body or a set of bodies, okay? And if we think about the temporal dispersion of slow violence, this can impact the way I think we perceive and represent and respond to a whole variety of crises, from domestic abuse to post-traumatic stress. Clearly, many of these are difficult to represent in a spectacular way, but are cumulative in their effects. But for today's talk, I want to focus specifically on the environmental dimensions to slow violence. A major challenge facing us as environmentalists is how to create stories, images, and symbols that can capture the slow motion catastrophes of delayed effects. Think of the following examples of slow violence: climate change, the thawing polar ice caps, the slow toxic drift of nitrates all the way down the Mississippi, from starting in Minnesota down to the Gulf of Mexico, where there's a dead zone larger than New Jersey. If we think of oil spills, deforestation, acidifying and warming oceans, if we think of biomagnification up the food chain, and a host of other slow unfolding environmental disasters, all of these pose, I think, formidable representational challenges that can hinder our effort to create the stories and images that are so necessary imaginatively for us to mobilize around. Slow violence, crucially, is not just accumulative, but also exponential very often. In other words, slow violence can operate as a major threat multiplier. It can fuel proliferating conflicts long term, conflicts that are often wrought from desperation, and these conflicts in turn then further degrade the conditions of life and can contribute to new rounds of conflicts. So to say all this is to recognize that different types of disaster are granted unequal coverage and unequal authority in the media. Falling bodies, burning towers, exploding heads, avalanches, volcanoes have a visceral page-turning potency. The tales of slow violence, which unfold over years, decades, maybe even centuries, the tales of slow violence lack. Stories of toxic buildup, accelerated species loss due to ravaged habitats, greenhouse gases massing. All of these may be cataclysmic, but they're scientifically convoluted cataclysms in which casualties are postponed often for generations. So a crucial question for us then is how in an age that reveres spectacle, when the media reveres spectacle, and when public policy is very much driven by perceived immediate need, by short-term need, how when we have this kind of media and this kind of public policy, short-term public policy drivers, how can we convert into image and narrative disasters that are slow moving and long in the making, disasters that are anonymous and star nobody, the celebrity deficient disasters, if you like, disasters that are gradual and of indifferent interest to the sensation-driven technologies of our media world. In other words, how can we turn these long emergencies into stories dramatic enough to rouse public emotions and warrant political intervention? So it's here then that we see a link between the imaginative and the challenges and the political challenges. To address this imaginative political link is to confront the dilemma that Rachel Carson, in her famous book Silent Spring, talked about almost half a century ago. Carson said that one of her objectives in that book was to draw attention to what she called death by indirection. That's her phrase, death by indirection. Her specific subjects were biomagnification, in other words, the accumulation of toxins up the food chain, and toxic drift. These forms of oblique, slow-acting violence, just like climate change, for instance, pose formidable imaginative difficulties for writers and environmental activists alike. One of the reasons is that these threats, these forms of death by indirection, are, in Carson's words, formless and obscure. They're difficult to nail down and they're difficult to give formal definition to. Okay? And you can see how, from a literary and a perspective of filmmaking, visual arts, this question of form becomes very, very central. What are the forms available to us that can help us make up for the drama deficit of these forms of death by indirection? Okay? How do we devise stories and symbols that can give living shape to amorphous calamities and infuse them with a kind of dramatic urgency? Okay? So I want to ground my broad comments here by turning to a few examples. Okay? First of all, thinking about wars, the way we represent and talk about wars, typically they're tidily bookended in the historical record. So just to take the example of the Vietnam War, in a recent New York Times editorial, the editorial said, quote, "During our dozen years in Vietnam, the US killed and helped kill at least 1.5 million people," unquote. But that simple word "during" shrinks the toll. Hundreds of thousands of people survived those war years, only to lose their lives prematurely to Agent Orange. The afflicted included thousands of children born long after the war's end. So more than 30 years after the last Agent Orange spraying run, Agent Orange continues to wreak havoc as, through biomagnification, dioxins build up in the fatty tissues of pivotal foods like duck and fish and pass from the natural world into the cooking pot and from there into ensuing human generations. And just 2 years ago, in 2009, the US Institute of Medicine added Parkinson's disease and heart disease, increased risk of Parkinson's disease and heart disease, as to their list, their long list of heightened threats that could result from exposure to Agent Orange. And so there are now 17 scientifically proven fatal conditions, potentially fatal conditions, that have been linked to Agent Orange. So if we think of that word "during" and we think of the way that war is bracketed, what it's ignoring, what these rhetorical conventions of talking about war ignore, are these ongoing belated casualties. Okay? A second military example. Slow violence casualties are hidden from view even more dramatically, perhaps, when we look at the advent of depleted uranium munitions, which have been deployed since the 1990-91 Gulf War. Okay? Depleted uranium possesses a durability almost beyond our comprehension. It has a radioactive half-life of 4.5 billion years. So when it enters the environment during the conflict, depleted uranium effectively does so for all time. And I wanted to quote from a US Colonel, James Norton, who reflected on this question of long-term risks. Is that right? Readable? Okay. Yeah, thanks. As he put it, we feel we have to use depleted uranium. It's radioactive. I wish it wasn't, but I can't change the laws of physics. The issue is, once you've had a hit, once you're involved in the catastrophic failure of the tank, did the crew survive long enough to really care whether it was tungsten or depleted uranium that hit them? Anyone who does should count themselves damn lucky. I'm sure every soldier would thank God that he lived 40 years to contract lymphoma. Okay. So what he's acknowledging here is different speeds of lethality, okay, and the way in which immediate risk, immediate harm is psychologically and strategically foregrounded, and the long-term knock-on effects of exposure are rendered invisible and can be discounted because they occur in a different time frame, okay? So this immediate violence in the heat of battle trumps the violence of deferred effects, the postponed violence. Now it seems to me that in our age of depleted uranium warfare, we have an ethical obligation to challenge the military body counts that consistently underestimate the true toll of waging high-tech wars. And that underestimation takes place very often both in advance and in retrospect. In other words, so when people are calculating likely casualties, these deferred casualties are typically excluded. And also in retrospect, after a war, the casualties typically, the counting typically excludes those who, many of whom have yet to die. So who's counting the victims of genetic deterioration, the stillborn malformed infants whose parents' DNA has been scrambled by war's toxins? The calculus of any such conflict then needs to incorporate environmental casualties, casualties that may suffer slow, invisible deaths that don't fit the news cycle of Fox News or CNN, but nonetheless warrant the dignity of being acknowledged as casualties, nonetheless. I want to turn now to a very different type of struggle against slow violence, and this is from East Africa, from Kenya. Some of you may have heard of Wangari Maathai, who I think in 2005 was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for her environmental activism among poor rural women in Kenya. And the particular struggle that she helped organize was against desertification, against the encroachment of the desert on once fertile land, through deforestation, through erosion of the land and the loss of soil as a result. Okay, and so she mobilized rural women who were most immediately impacted by the march of the desert. These were women who would have to walk longer distances to collect firewood, to collect water, and who were most responsible for the nutrition of their children. And this is what Wangari Maathai had to say. During the rainy season, thousands of tons of topsoil are eroded from Kenya's countryside by rivers and washed into the ocean and lakes. Additionally, soil is lost through wind erosion in areas where the land is devoid of vegetative cover. Losing topsoil should be considered analogous to losing territory to an invading enemy. And indeed, if any country were so threatened, it would mobilize all available resources, including a heavily armed military, to protect the priceless land. Unfortunately, she continues, the loss of soil through these elements has yet to be perceived with such urgency. So I think what's striking about the way she reformulates the question of security here is her insistence that we think about security in sustainable ways, and that we think about these forms of slow violence, like deforestation, like soil erosion, the failure to arrest those forms of slow violence, as threats to the nation's integrity, to the viability long-term of the nation. Okay, so to reframe violence in this way is to change the language of national defense. It may be helpful here to situate slow violence in relation to changes in the way that we now inhabit time. Ours is an age of onrushing digital capitalism, where the present for many of us feels more abbreviated than it used to. And at least for the world's privileged classes who live surrounded by technological time savers, we often have the sensation of being time poor. Okay, that we're both have all of these conveniences that allow us to multitask and so forth, but we're also short of time in some ways. And it seems to me that one of the most pressing challenges, certainly environmentally, one of the most pressing challenges we face is how to adjust our rapidly eroding attention spans to the slow erosions of environmental justice. If, as I was suggesting at the outset today, if the gulf or the canyon between the ultra-rich and the outcast poor, if this gulf is widening and deepening, we should also acknowledge that ours is an era where we're living in an era of enclave time, where speed has become, for many, a self-justifying ethic that makes it harder to focus and take in so-called uneventful violence. In other words, unspectacular violence that becomes a weak claimant on our time and a weak claimant on our ethical imagination. So then, in an age of degraded attention spans, it becomes doubly urgent to focus on the toll exacted over time by the slow violence of ecological degradation. The writer Cory Doctorow has described our era as an era when the electronic screen has created an ecosystem of interruption technologies, Or, as former Microsoft executive Linda Stone has put it, ours is an age, quote, of continuous partial attention, unquote. Continuous partial attention. Fast is faster than it used to be, and the story units have become, accordingly, shorter. In this cultural milieu, the intergenerational aftermath thus becomes a harder sell. So then, to render slow violence visible entails partly redefining speed. And we see such efforts to redefine speed with talk of accelerated species loss. And if we think of the dead metaphor of glacial used to mean slow, now it means unacceptably fast loss. Okay, there's been an inversion of that metaphor. What does it take then, in an age of fractured attention spans, to represent effectively the science and politics of long-term damage? And I want to ground this question by turning to attempts by the leaders of an Indian Ocean island nation called the Maldives to represent this attritional threat posed by climate change. Okay. The Maldives are a series of atoll islands in the Indian Ocean, a population about 400,000, And one of the things that has happened is with the warming of the oceans, the coral reefs have died off, the protective coral reefs that shelter these islands from extreme weather. And so they did in an effort to replicate the protective mechanisms of the coral reefs is to build this seawall around the main island of Malé. Now, one of the things that's happening here in the Maldives is that this is the first nation state in the line of fire in terms of inundation by rising sea levels, okay? The highest point, you'll appreciate this living in Provo, the highest peak in the Maldives is 7 feet, okay, which is about Yao Min's high. I mean, so they really are, in a sense, a nation of imminent climate refugees, okay? And so their situation, their plight, and their experience of time, the experience of the emergencies of the long term, gives us a kind of a foreshadowing of the longer term challenges that ultimately will face so many other low-lying nations like Bangladesh, to name one, Sri Lanka, and ultimately the very large numbers of people who live along the coasts. If we think of the major cities of the world, so many of them are disproportionately low-lying sea level cities. Now, just before the 2009 Copenhagen Climate Summit, the Maldivian Prime Minister, Mohamed Nasheed, convened a cabinet meeting, okay? Those of you who professors know what it's like to be drowning in paperwork. Well, yeah, he's kind of made it literal. And this effort on behalf of the Maldivian Prime Minister was an effort to counteract two problems of invisibility. The first was the invisibility of the slow violence of the long term, in other words, of an attritional crisis. How do you make it visible? How do you make it dramatic, emotionally effective, okay? The second challenge was, how does a minnow nation like the Maldives, that probably most people on earth do not even know exists, how does a nation like that get some kind of ethical or political leverage? And so to compensate for these two convergent forms of invisibility, Mohamed Nasheed convened this meeting and turned to the symbolic realm, if you like, of underwater theater. And so we can view this as this ghostly scene, this underwater scene, as a kind of premonitory landscape, a foreshadowing, and a foreshadowing of the global consequences of wasted foreknowledge. In other words, we can read this scene as a preview, as a theatrical preview of the aftermath. We can also read this photograph as an image of reverse inundation. There's been a very long-term, very tenacious trope in North America, in Europe, and elsewhere of societies being swamped by immigrants. The idea that there'll be an inundation of immigrants, typically brown bodies, threatening to overwhelm predominantly white rich societies. And here what we have is an inversion, in a sense, of that trope, where you have a third world society inundated by the long-term fallout from a 200-year experiment in carbon consumption and extraction, the primary historic beneficiaries of whom have been relatively affluent and white. Okay? So this image then strikes at the whole debate over climate justice. In other words, how do we measure ethically the temporal inequities of who has benefited from this long-term carbon culture, and the predominantly poor people who are in the firing line, the first line of fire of the climate crisis. That's the Maldivian flag in the background, and typically flag planting is more associated with mountain peaks than with ocean floors, and so there's a sort of the flag is being used here clearly in an ironic sense to mark involuntary conquest. Okay, and without this compensatory image of the photograph and the video, which was incorporated into a group called 350.org that Bill McKibben has been very, very active in, and was distributed very widely on YouTube and elsewhere. Without this compensatory agency of the image, the flag would be left to flap invisibly on the ocean floor. Okay? So there's a very conscious use of the media on Mohammed Nasheed's part. But I can't observe this submerged flag without thinking of a second flag that went up or went down almost simultaneously, which was a flag planted by a Russian submarine on the seabed of the North Pole. And this flag planting marked a very different oceanic land grab, and a less ironic one. The Russian expedition leader declared, quote unquote, "the Arctic is Russian." Denmark immediately disputed the Kremlin's claim to the Arctic continental shelf. Russia dispatched troop reinforcements to the Arctic edge. Canada declared it was going to build a port city in the Arctic. And the US, Norway, and the European Union all climbed into controversy with claims on the seabed, on the continental shelf itself. Okay, so global warming was the trigger for these troop movements and this militant rhetoric. And so what you have is as many of you know, the melting Arctic pack ice has opened up the prospects both of new sea lanes, which are strategically important, and also opening up or making accessible hitherto inaccessible mineral deposits, particularly of gas and oil. And so we face the prospect of expanded sub-oceanic carbon reserves being extracted and burned, courtesy of global warming that has exposed them in the first place, okay? Accelerating the very processes of slow violence that will drown the Maldives first, but ultimately, unchecked, will breach the walls that concretize our planetary delusion that we can separate out secure societies long-term from insecure ones, orderly societies from societies abandoned to destitution and climate chaos. So in trying imaginatively to think through these two flags, one in the Arctic, one in the Indian Ocean, together, one of the things I'm trying to think through is these different time frames of disaster, the short term and the long term, and how the Arctic carbon bonanza is, in the most literal sense, a race to the bottom. These two scenes remind us that the climate crisis is indivisible ultimately, even if experienced initially by some of the planet's most vulnerable people. So one of these seabed scenes serves as a starting gun for the 21st century scramble by global powers to colonize even more of the Earth's resources. The other scene, in the Maldives Islands, gives a whole new ecological twist to the anti-colonial phrase, the development of underdevelopment. The post-colonial critic Edward Said once wrote of what he called the normalized quiet of unseen power. The normalized quiet of unseen power. This normalized quiet is of particular pertinence, I suggest, to the hushed havoc and the harmful invisibility that slow violence generates. It is the poor and above all the impoverished in the global south who live in the front lines of slow violence. The invisibility of their poverty is exacerbated or heightened by the invisibility of slow violence that permeates so many of their lives. Our age's temporal bias towards spectacular, instantaneous violence heightens the vulnerability of ecosystems that are treated as disposable, while simultaneously heightening the vulnerability of disposable people, people who are treated as disposable, as inconsequential. And so it's these convergent forms of disposability. It's in protesting these convergent forms of disposability that we have seen a resurgence, particularly in the global south, of social movements that have come under the banner of the environmentalism of the poor. To end then, we can see the slow violence of delayed effects as shaping so many of our most significant forgettings. Violence, above all environmental violence, needs to be seen as a contest between spectacular and unspectacular time. We face here a double challenge. The challenge of dramatizing slow-moving violence and of making visible the impact of that violence on vulnerable, poor communities who are underrepresented in the first place. Yet these are the very communities, again and again, that are mobilizing to try to make that violence visible, to break through to media and political awareness, and thereby to arrest its downstream devastations. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes or so for questions. If anyone would like to ask questions, feel free.
Yeah, thanks.
I wonder if one way of making it visible, one forum for addressing it would be through trauma studies, kind of PTSD and the post-traumatic war as a way of, I guess, harnessing or gathering or focusing media attention on the effects of slow violence.
Yeah, I do think there's a very... The question was about whether one way of harnessing this awareness could be through trauma studies. And I do think there's a very strong convergence between the kind of attritional suffering that, say, returning veterans experience, and the kind of attritional suffering that people in these damaged environments feel. And a lot of it has to do with a sense of being occupied or haunted by both the past and the future. And as we all know, living in a condition of traumatic uncertainty is profoundly distressing and damaging in and of itself. So I think definitely there's an overlap between trauma studies and, if you like, environmental trauma studies. Yeah, George.
Yeah, I wonder if you're persuaded by Steven Pinker's argument, his new thesis, that the world is getting less and less violent, more and more safe, that we're less and less willing to kill people. I mean, it seems like it runs right in.
Yeah. No, I've been thinking a lot about that book, which has been getting a lot of attention. It's called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And basically his argument, it's kind of sunny side up sociobiology, if you like. His argument is that in evolutionary terms, humans have been becoming more and more ethical, and we're killing way less than we used to, okay? And so he starts with the Mongol hordes and so forth, and says, well, the proportion of people who were living on the planet at that time that are being killed was far greater than it is today, and he has several hundred pages of really gruesome, gory, sensational stuff, which you read through in order to you realize that Second World War and the Holocaust and Stalin and everything like that weren't as bad as they actually seem, because at least we're not living, several millennia ago. Well, no, I have a lot of problem with that argument, precisely because he doesn't look at the question of technology. And if we think about the examples of barbarism that he focuses on in the first few hundred pages, you know, a spear in the chest or being clubbed on the head typically leads to instant violence, and it's countable in certain ways. I mean, he's relying on archaeological approximation, so how countable it is, we don't know. But if you think about how the technologies of war have changed, I mean, there are still people who are dying from unexploded ordnance in the forests of France and Belgium from World War I, okay? Not large numbers, but still people. If we then factor in the downwinders, we factor in, you know, cluster bombs, unexploded cluster bombs, 100 million landmines that still are lying around from any number of different wars. It seems to me that we need to find a different way of counting or acknowledge that the technologies of war change the way, the time frame within which people die and in which casualties occur. So he uses very conventional kind of dates. You know, the war began here, the war ended here, as if nobody after 1945 died from World War II, or same with Vietnam and that. So no, I think it's a very good point here. Yeah.
I'm thinking about this image that you show and wondering what the response would be. And I guess the first response from the wealthy countries would be to just try to make sure that people don't know about this, because it's going to be very upsetting to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
The second response after that, if it doesn't work, would be something like, well, you know, globalization and market economies have always demanded a certain price. And the old story was that people had to move when there were no more jobs in their town.
Mm-hmm.
This is just a new version of it. They have to move when there's no more dry land or there's no more arable land. So it's just the same old thing, and it's not really a tragedy at all. It's just the natural workings of the market playing themselves out now on a global scale when it used to be a much more regional or local scale.
Right.
What do you think Mohammed Nasheed can say to something like that? Because that's going to be the argument.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think one of the things is you have to look at the limits of self-interest in a world where these challenges are being compounded. Okay. In the case of the Maldives, if we go back to the Marshall Islands and Bikini Atoll and the nuclear experiments there were small numbers of people, a couple of thousand, who were displaced ahead of those nuclear tests. Okay. By the time you get to the Maldives, you're talking about 400,000 people in a world where land shortage and food production are critical issues. Okay. It becomes a kind of a test case for either how munificent people can be, generally, saying, yeah, come and take our land, or what kind of structures of inclusion and exclusion are going to dominate in the decades ahead. And even there was a 2003 Pentagon report talking about the likely impact of climate change and the need to fortify, for greater fortification of resources that are going to be challenged by people thrown into increasing desperation by climate change. Okay, so we see, already with desertification in Africa and so forth, we see these waves of immigrants trying to get to Europe and being rebuffed and drowned and so forth. And I think what Mohammed Nasheed and others have been trying to dramatize is the fact that this isn't only a problem for the first wave of desperados, if you like, but it's a structural global problem, and that you can build larger and larger walls against extreme weather or against climate refugees, but ultimately the scale of the problem is going to come home to everybody. And so I think that I have heard exactly that argument that you're ventriloquizing there, but those are more localized arguments about immigrating towards jobs, but immigrating as refugees, I think on this scale is of a different order. Yeah. Right.
I know that's not good for the economy, but
yeah.
One question I have is I read recently that once 10% of the population gets a hold of an idea, that you sort of reach a tipping point. Do you think we're approaching that with the kind of thinking you're exposing here and things that I'm thinking?
Right.
Do you think we're really getting there where it could make a difference?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether we're at 10% yet, but I do think that they're increasing, and I think it's a component of these manifold social uprisings of this year. There is a sense, and I see it particularly among young people, that short-term thinking hasn't delivered, and that feeds directly into environmental short-term thinking, but it's not limited to it. It concerns question of student debt. It concerns questions of people graduating and educational prospects, and that there's I think a real impatience with the political establishment, with the financial establishment, that the kind of smash and grab attitude to resources is neither ethical nor is it inclusive enough to create a sustainable civic society and to offer people long-term dignity. And so I do think that there are various broader rhetorics to which this can be articulated, rhetorics of stewardship, rhetorics of fairness, rhetorics of decency, that don't need to be restricted to sort of what might have been perceived traditionally as narrowly environmental, as special interest. I think time is not a special interest. We all deal with time, and we all perceive time in terms of our dreams. And I think it's in that context that these kinds of coalitions are building. Yeah. Yeah.
Last question. One of the images for me that was most striking about Occupy Wall Street was a sign of a video image of Zizek down in Wall Street rallying the troops, right? And it really brought home just how much notions of political activism, whether it be Marxian or more recent by view, etc., articulated by ideas of the event, right? The dramatic moment right now, we act changes right now. And I'm thinking about this slow incremental time. Is there, as you see it, an adequate slow incremental politics, or must we respond to slow time, slow violence, through kind of a, again, sort of activist politics that's sort of momentary in nature? Is there, in other words, is there a correlative in politics you're describing in terms of violence with the environment?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point, and I think inevitably, say filmmakers, activists, writers, try to create some kind of punctuation marks so that there are these arresting images. At the same time as something like 350.org is a slow-building movement, so you're working in these different timeframes all at once, and. I think that these sort of dramatic images are necessary if we think, but at the same time, the movement, the slow protest, if you like, has to evolve in a different in a different time frame. I don't know if any of you have come across this movie Gasland by Josh Fox. Which is a movie exposing the hazards of fracking, hydraulic fracturing, these new technologies that are involve enormous amounts of water in order to force out gas. Okay? And he came up with an image in that movie that really created a kind of an image around which to coalesce. And that was the image of going to various people's homes in Pennsylvania, Wyoming, Texas, and he would turn on the faucet and take a cigarette lighter, and the flames would come out. Okay? So it was a very powerful, intimate, domestic image of, okay, you turn on the faucet, you're expecting water, and what you get is gas at inflammatory levels. And he used that image. It was in the trailer of the movie. It was on YouTube and so forth, to cut through a lot of the complex politics, a lot of the complex science around hydraulic fracturing. And I was really impressed with that. And then if you look at the entire movie, you get a very different, longer, more complex version of the science and politics. Similarly, there was a group of NYU students who produced something called the Fracking Song. It was a kind of rap song that got a couple of million hits, I think, and did a great job of putting the science to music. And it's like, 3.5 minutes or something. So I think one of the things that I studied with Edward Said, and one of the things that I was always really impressed by was the way in which he was constantly trying to adapt his knowledge to different audiences, to different mediums, to different technologies. So that if you've been interviewed by NPR, you're not giving the same lecture as you are to the MLA or something. That you have this body of knowledge, and you're constantly trying to think through, how can I use this technology to the advantage of this particular cause or this particular ethic? And I think now, we have ever more technologies at our disposal, and I am really impressed by the creativity with which young people in particular are coming at these issues using that.
Thank you very much, Rob.